Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Adam. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
Not too bad. Not too bad. Given that semester turnover has just happened and it's very, very busy, but academics know that. So it's a normal academic life.
Hmm. And normal academic life has not completely been disrupted by ChatGPT yet.
Well, that is actually big disruption. I mean, I'm saying that it used to be that you had all these cheating websites and then the cheating services where you would pay people to write your final report, you would pay people to do your take-it-home exam, things like that. They were bad enough. Of course, now the one thing that makes me happy is that they will go out of business now. Because let's put it this way, although ChatGPT makes our life harder now, I think at least there's some kind of satisfaction in the fact that people who actually actively try to subvert the value of academic degrees will have now to find an honest way of doing what they do. And to be honest, what's really sad about the whole story is that essentially academic grades are a bit like a currency. And when it's subverted, it's like printing fake money. So it is a bit of an issue. On the other hand, ChatGPT will be publicly available and it's going to stay. And so we need to ask ourselves, okay, now that this kind of currency is no longer valid in that form that it was, we have to ask yourself, okay, what now? How do things look now? What is it that we are going to assess now? The question is also if assessment is the right thing to do, but I don't think it's going to go away because people like numbers on paper that say, oh, that person is that good or that good or that good. This is something that yeah, there's a certain religion that believes that the number on paper tells the story about what somebody can do. Although we do know, academics do know that grades matter only to quite a limited degree. So how to measure that is an interesting question. But ChatGPT is definitely a game changer. And I do agree with some people that say it's a tool. The big problem is if this tool does the job that, say, not so excited student does, what is the added value that such an excited student can add to a product produced by ChatGPT to make him deserve his mark, rather than I typed this in the machine and I submitted what came out. So we will have to ask ourselves, okay, how do we give the people actually the opportunity to do added value? Unless we say, and that would be the most radical take, no, let's just have most people who write these second-rate reports, that are not particularly deep, but they have to be written. Let them just get a salary for free, and let ChatGPT do all the money, produce all these reports, and earn the money and pay taxes for that. So in other words, you essentially relieve proportion of people whose job can be replaced by such a machine, by the machine, and the machine pays taxes and therefore basic income. That would be one option that probably at some point will be considered. I'm not saying it's going to happen in the next 5 years, possibly not even the next 15, but at some point when we put out so many people out of business that we end up with either very low rank jobs which cannot yet be done by machines, or the top level jobs that also cannot be done by machines, then the rest of the population needs to live. We have to make sure that they have a life and dignity. And that will mean basic income funded by taxes paid by machines.
When do you think, or I guess, what do you think of the scaling hypothesis? And so the perplexity keeps going down and doesn't show signs of abating with increasing compute, but how far do you think how far will it be just a matter of scale for performance increases or additional tricks? But and then like what's the limit? Like at what what's the limit that we might expect for mass language models?
So first of all, let me just ask, which definition of perplexity do you have in mind before I answer the question?
I forget the exact ones used for the scaling hypothesis, but the idea though that it's like I've always or rather I've been of the opinion that it's kind of like Searle's Chinese room with these mass language models ultimately, and that without a kind of symbol grounding that's actually grounded in a flexible causal world model, it can only go so far. And eventually you're running into combinatorial explosions of like unbounded like possible worlds being signified. Right. But like that being said, that's not what the data shows so far. The data is showing just for me, the bitter lesson is just compute is dominating. And just the performance.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, neural networks do work. So despite being over parameterized, they do work. And we don't fully understand why. I mean, there's a new paper that I still have to read by Thomas Martinez, and they have some idea about essentially counting functions, but I have to read the paper in detail. Why actually neural networks work despite being over parameterized. So this either indicates that the space of possibilities is actually nice, which I suspect, right? I mean, the world is nice to some extent. It's not arbitrary. You don't create all the possible worlds. There are limitations, there are constraints on the world. That's one thing. The other thing is, of course, well, how far can this go? Now, you see, when I looked at ChatGPT's outputs, one thing that struck me was all the stories about confidently saying wrong things felt actually oddly familiar. In fact, there are lines of jobs where you do that. You confidently say wrong things, or you do say things that are sometimes right, mostly right, but sometimes completely wrong. And an example are second-rate politicians or second-rate journalists. I mean, I'm not talking about first-rate ones, right? They're different story. First-rate people are always a completely different class, but second-rate ones can very confidently tell you a story that you fully believe. I'm not an expert, and it sounds eloquently written, and it doesn't mean anything, or it doesn't have an idea what's going on. Also, the stories about ChatGPT basically apologizing for getting it wrong and then fixing it somehow. That's very, very, very typical for also political maneuvering. In other words, you could actually say that second-rate politicking is language game, right? So the knowledge is not so much about the real world, which some people actually accuse politicians not to understand the real world. It's about knowing how to use words and knowing how to use words to get certain effects, basically. So in other words, ChatGPT is quite human. It's not like, oh, it can't. It's actually quite human in the sense that it understands the patterns of making things sound right. Of course, it's not embodied, right? So this is clearly doesn't understand the world, but this is not a fundamental problem. I mean, simulators get better. It's only a question of time when you start having this thing linked to a simulator and observing things and being able to play with things. Because let's face it, humans learn by intervention. Humans learn by causal intervention. And this is very clearly a big advantage. We know that learning from observations, from pure observations without intervention, is much, much harder than if you can intervene. Because with intervention, you can ask the right questions. With intervention, you can check the causal alternatives. With intervention, you can actually find out, is this channel actually just correlated? Is it caused? You can find that out. And there's a good reason why modern science actually exploded after Galilei. The experiment as a question to nature, as an interventional question to nature, this is one of the things that the Greeks actually failed to do. They actually did not appreciate experiments as a controlled way of us talking to nature. They sat there and listened to nature talk, basically. The Romans never bothered too much with the questions. They just got things done. That was all the way they cared about. But so they could have been experimentalists, but they were not. But the modern science starts when you start asking questions. So ChatGPT doesn't have the ability to do that. It cannot intervene. It sees the documents, learns the documents. But I do think once you introduce intervention, the capability of learning it will be far extended. And the question is, how far? I don't think right now that it would be appropriate to name a limit. Right? We are not in the time where, oh, it will go until here. That's, that's the type of futurology I don't like. There are people, oh, it will never be possible to do X. Come on. I mean, we know this is nonsense, right? It will never be possible to fly with aircrafts heavier than air. It will never be possible to fly to space. It will never be we know that this is all nonsense, right? There are things which will never be possible for physical reasons, like flying faster than light. And even that seems also not to be cast in stone, because all it says, there are certain principles that you cannot in your local reference frame move faster relative velocities than light. But people already start experimenting with ideas actually stemming from science fiction, with the bubbles of distorted space. This is pure theory, but it's not forbidden by general relativity. And so talking, it's never is not a word I'm going to use. Question is, will it happen? Now, to be honest, the large language models surprised me. I was generally surprised about the power of these models. But on the other hand, look, I mean, 400 billion parameters or whatever it is, that's a lot. And why shouldn't we be able to combine all the sentences into something sensible? The thing that we need to see, is it able to learn is it able to incorporate new knowledge? Is it able to, and let's face it, I mean, humans learn language and can learn how to do language with much fewer parameters or examples. We don't have to learn everything that's on the internet to be able to create literature. So there's definitely something that humans still can do that machines, we did not get right with machines. I'm not saying it's impossible. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this is generally impossible. What I'm saying is that the way machines achieve it is not the way we do it. And the question is it superior? I think it's missing a very important facet, and that's a ability to see beyond the confines of what it has seen. I think it's very good at interpolating. I think it's not good at extrapolating, in a nutshell.
So if we hooked it up to some simulation environment where it could attempt to more robustly, or maybe at all, ground its symbols, like so it can places where it can enact the do operator in different ways and run experiments on different possibilities. It seems like that would get maybe some it seems like that would gain in performance. What I wonder is the extent to which pragmatics and implicature creep into even like the most technical writing, and where things like metaphorical constructions, where it's like there's a cipher of basically a theory of the mind and the life world of your interlocutor, where that's where you have a causal world model operating under like what's important to them and what are they trying to communicate now. And I don't know the range of things for which that's necessary. This presentation I used to give pitched it to the deep minders once at this safety meetup at NeurIPS in 2018. But like you can, like anything involving people doing things and like multi-step plans, it seems like there you might need the common ground of a real like common grounding, like you might even need to have a similar motivational structure. But one of the things I wonder is like, let's say we wanted like an AI scientist, and so it doesn't, and so it's just operating in this world and it's reading technical papers. How far could it go? Like I know there is like implicature and pragmatics and metaphor even in the most technical writing, but is that not though an obstacle to maybe basically a largely self-directed AI scientist? Like what would we need for that?
I mean, for a self-directed AI scientist, I think you need 2 or 3 things. First of all, you need to think out of the box. Okay, if it's supposed to be original, right? One of the weaknesses of this type of neural networks, ChatGPT, etc., seems to be that they are not actually creating a climax in whatever the story they're telling. So the stories are bland. I found that, for example, with computer-generated music, it's good music, and you have these really well-written pieces. There's one composing algorithm, I forgot the name, it starts with E, and it produces Chopin-like, I think it's Chopin-like music, and really sounds like Chopin locally. Globally, it's like, okay, what's the point? Where it's going? What's happening? Is there a climax? Is it going somewhere? And doesn't seem to, right? It meanders here, meanders there. So it's a little bit impolite to say, but it's a bit like elevator music, if you get my gist, right? It's the type of music that keeps you from doing bad things when you're in the parking lot at night. Kind of the bland, nice, lovely, but ultimately meaningless music. And I think it's undirected, right? Okay, you can give it direction. That's possible. But I think for an AI scientist, you need more. Direction is not enough. So you have direction in a Go playing program. In Go playing programs, you have direction. They want to win, and they have a tendency to win, and they win. Just recently, there was actually a report about a guy that played such a machine, and actually they found a flaw in the algorithms. And the question is a significant one, and the flaw is so bad that even a mediocre Go player can exploit it. So in other words, these programs that are supposed to be on the level of the best, strongest Go playing program ever conceived, or the strongest Go player ever on this planet, seem to have a flaw that can be exploited by mediocre player. Yeah, it's almost really like in this kind of fun movie, Independence Day, the original one, where they have this stupid virus and that takes apart the alien fleet, and I was thinking, yes, this is the same thing, right? You have this completely mediocre, second-rate human scientists against this absolutely top-notch alien species, and they found this really stupid flaw that takes apart the whole fleet. It's kind of fun to think about that, and that can be. Humans are usually very adaptive. They see these things. I remember that when I was playing against a Go playing program many years ago, when they were still not very good, and I'm not a very good Go player either. I think it was Many Faces of Go. That was the program that I played against, and it really crushed me. Right, it squeezed me in the corner, took all my space, and in my desperation, I started to take basically a battlefield. In Go, what happens is you play these moves where you try to conquer space. You try to enclose areas and make these areas your own, so the opponent cannot build a so-called living group there that cannot be killed. So you take this space, and then you essentially can squeeze out the opponent. The opponent may be still there, but effectively it will not succeed in building a sustainable group. And I explained that for our general audience. And what you often do when you see that the situation is lost, you see your group is lost, it will not sustain itself, you give it up. You basically leave it where it is and start doing something else, because time is super critical in Go. Tempo is extremely critical in Go. You really want to be the first moving, making an initiative somewhere. So you leave these things be, and I had this big group that was captured by the machine and had no chance of survival. And the machine started messing around with me, and I decided my desperation, okay, let's see whether I can make it live. So I tried to play in this actually lost situation, and the machine did not react. At first, I thought, okay, maybe they see that's not necessary. But then I realized they just didn't see it as a threat. And I was thinking, the machine doesn't see it. A human would have immediately seen it. Even the beginner would have seen, oh, he's playing there. Something interesting is going to happen. I have to pay attention. The machine just didn't care. It did conquer the rest and consolidate everything else. And I decided, okay, now I'm going to play that. I played and played and played. And really, I'm not a very good player. But in the end, what happened was that I got my group revived. And basically, the whole game just tipped around, basically by 100 points. I don't remember how much. It was huge. Basically, from complete disastrous loss, the game turned a total win for me.
You sent hobbits into Mordor. You sent hobbits into Mordor.
Basically, yes. Basically,
hobbits were not legible to Mordor in terms of the power flows being tracked.
Basically, yes. Basically, yes. Yes, that's what happened. So it really struck me. So the machine, and any human would have seen it. Any moderately advanced beginner would have seen that. So it was not like something that was very clever trick by which nothing very clever. It was very plain. And it means that humans can abstract developments on a level that machines simply don't do. Now, maybe you can have some very clever, theorem proving devices that can prove theorems and can predict this. But when we look at humans are not born as theorem proving devices. Theorem proving needs to be learned a lot, and it takes a long time. So there's something else going on. There's something humans just break through walls in how they look at problems. They don't look at problems through their constraints. In fact, constraints make it harder for humans, but make it easier for machines. Constraints tell to machines, okay, there's a constraint, and now they do your search, and your search just respects the constraint. That's not what humans do. Humans do not respect the constraints. They ignore them. And then they make an approximation, see where does it lead them. And then they find whether it's a good idea to ignore the constraint or they have to take it into account. So in fact, humans, when people say think out of the box, that's precisely what it means, in my opinion. Thinking out of the box means thinking outside of the constraints that you assume define your universe. And humans are surprisingly good at that. I mean, not everyone is at the same level, of course. Not everyone is Einstein. Not everybody is Feynman or whatever. But the point is, even generic humans are able to think beyond constraints.
When we encounter a constraint, and we're thinking outside of it, to what degree is it almost like a kind of like I don't know if I'd say stubbornness or stochasticity, but I'm thinking of something like you quantum tunnel to another area of this landscape you're optimizing over, but you just kind of, I'm stuck, I go anywhere. Or to what degree is it directed to reach a specific destination on the outside of those constraints? Like, I remember you mentioning like with E. coli, like it can't actually detect the gradient along the length of its body. And so it'll just like set in motion attacks anywhere just to get to a different place. But it's not actually like a bona fide teleology. It's just a heuristic that works. So
this is a very nice example because I also like this coli example a lot. I use it a lot, actually. So one way of looking at constraints is, what is a constraint? I mean, you can say a constraint is just a law of nature. This is the constraint, that you can't do anything about that. But I do think that if you don't know about this law of nature, you can pretend it's not there. You know, we can pretend we're flying, right? We can imagine Superman. I could explain Superman to an old Greek. I was flying something. Hermes was flying through the air. This was not possible at that time. It's very clearly that the first flying people we don't know when it was first attempted, but you know, I would say that probably the first flying people were Montgolfier or something like that. So it's clearly we can imagine an abstraction of things we have not seen by taking away some assumptions, just ignoring them. Now, for example, if you look at, okay, you could say, okay, birds can fly and we can see birds flying white, and then you combine that with humans. But there are other things like, I have always a little joke. I say, what was the first human? And I say the first human was the ape that pointed to the moon and said, I want this, or I want to go there. I have no idea whether apes actually, how they relate to the moon, or whether actually they think about the moon at all, right? But I would say the first human was whoever pointed to the moon, said, I want this, or I want to go there, and understood that this is an object, even if it's not reachable, that in principle, I could want or go there. So the question is a little bit, can we break out of the implicit constraints and demand something that is outside of our, how to say, clear sensory motor experience? It's clearly outside there, right? Now, of course, one constraint might be language. right? Without language, you can't do that. But I don't think it's like that, because you can have intelligent animals that understand that going through the wall is not possible, but I could try to find a way to get to the other side. I do think that that's something that intelligent animals could do. I'm talking apes, I'm talking ravens. Don't know whether there are experiments to that extent, but I can imagine that you would think, okay, there's a way of getting around it. What I would say, what we need is a set of experiments that avoids the pitfalls of what I call puzzle-like experiments, in the sense that in a puzzle, basically you have to fiddle around with stuff and find some things that work, and at some point that just breaks open, right? So many of the experiments that do with intelligent birds are puzzle-like. They're complicated, and the birds need a lot of memory for that. But in the end of the day, you don't have simple intuition of how to open this puzzle, right? You play around with the puzzle. At some point, you learn it, then you have a kind of script, but it's not like you have this puzzle and then you know exactly what to do because it's obvious to you that when you see it. Usually, it's not like that. There are exceptions, for example, in the case where they throw stones into a tube to make the water level rise, and therefore the food come up. But generally, there are this puzzly experiments, in my opinion, do not actually demonstrate the ability to abstract from constraints. They do something else. But I think for the actual breakthroughs, and I would use the word carefully, you need a wall that you can break through, and you need to have something that intuitively tells you, well, if I break through this wall, there's something else behind it, which if the wall wasn't there, I could go straight through without worrying. And I'm not sure how suitable experiments would look like, but they would have to be something like that, like there's something on the other side of the wall. Will the raven go around the corner to see whether there's another way to get there, etc.? And not by, yeah.
I feel like DeepMind, they were pretty misleading with the breakout game because they wanted to make it seem like there was this one exploit where like a very efficient solution of like tunneling, I think it was like on the side, and then once you got the ball up there, like it did a lot of the work for you. You didn't even have to knock it, but it was more just something. I don't think it was like of the kind you're describing, of a kind of like a look ahead and a sudden restructuring. It was just it discovered it. But I wonder, like with like animals that do show this sort of intentional insight capacities, like to what degree is it not just like a general capacity for maybe like recursive modeling? I'm sure that's important, but like birds actually have to fly around things. They have experiences of like, or if you're arboreal, like an ape, like you have experience, like there's an obstacle and I am going to work my way through it. And I wonder, like, is that actually where some of the prowess comes from, even?
Maybe, although I think it's more general than that, because mathematicians have that. They move in a very complex space, extremely complex space. And that space is, yeah, it's arboreal, lots of stuff in the way, but it's also high dimensional. And yet they talk about directions. They talk about, I'm taking a direction. And they understand what the direction is. Direction is a global thing. It's not a local thing, it's a global thing. It says all the way there, that's where I'm going. I don't know how to get there. I don't even know whether there is a path there, but I have an idea that there, in this kind of cone of futures, lies where I want to go. And that is kind of something which I do think we have an idea how it works. We don't know why it works so effectively. I think the algorithms we have today completely lack this. They don't have that at all. What they do have is an unbelievable ability to, of course, create all the possible futures and then pick the promising ones simply because of pure numbers, which is something that organisms don't have the luxury to afford. Yeah, if you have a bird, if you have an insect, they don't have this computational capacity, so they have to do it differently. And I do think the trick must be that they somehow abstract away all the complexities of the detailed route by saying, oh well, it must be somewhere in this cone of possible future trajectories, because it's very clear that we learn language fast and we don't have to read all the texts, and we have ideas of how to abstract away stuff. And as I said, even some completely uninitiated, I mean, I had this argument, this discussion with somebody who said, oh, this trick to beat the strongest Go program in the world was a cheat, because they actually used computers to find the flaw in the strategy of these programs, right? So the computers found the flaw that you could actually surround the group and basically kill it, as even at mediocre level. And that sounds a bit like a cheat in a way, but first of all, it has to be still the human that does it. So it's not computer-aided human strategy, it's computer-aided training of a human, which is a different story. So the humans still beat the machines. And the second thing is the human could understand what it was that they would beat them. So the strategy was something that was communicable to a human. And the third argument is mine, because I did that without help, beating the many phases of Go, whatever the program was called, with seeing that I could make basically resurrect a group that was basically dead. And I resurrected it without any help from outside. So there is something where these algorithms completely lack an understanding of how their world looks like. They are incredibly good at, and beat every human out of the water in modeling the detailed looks of this world, the intermediate properties, the interpolation, if you like. It is completely incapable of saying, how does this world look outside of my realm of the training? And the interesting part of that is that if you look at, there are chess problems, which typically they consist of some rows of pawns that stand in a row and so on, or when you have, for example, a bishop on a white field, and you see this bishop never will be able to checkmate the opponent king, simply because it can never go in a black field, which you need to get the king cornered. This is something that an advanced beginner in chess can see, but a machine, unless it's coded in, will never see it, because all it does is just rolling forward all the possibilities, but it has no concept unifying all these possible routes to the future in a simple message like, no, you will not be able to switch colors as a bishop. You could code that in. You could code that in, but that's a cheat again, right? You want to have a consistent algorithm that does it.
I guess so some might suggest we could get to that kind of sophisticated performance with that kind of sophisticated look ahead abilities with maybe some sort of like multi-tier or like meta learning architecture where you're able to have maybe a hierarchically higher system that's specifically optimized for tracing the long range dependencies and for like working with like a coarse grain description. And then it's like kind of like Benjo's G-flow nets, or like Julie George is working with like clone structure cognitive graphs, all these different like attempts at reverse engineering the hippocampal system is basically giving you this discretization of this state space you're working within, and then learning how to basically find these trajectories through these different waypoints we want in your planning. But I guess I still wonder though, like, so what you're describing of like when you were sending the Hobbit into Go Mordor, It's like there was it seemed like there was like a physical type of simulation that was being leveraged. Like this thing was like a little creature that had its own sort of like autopoietic power. This wasn't just like you're tracing a long range of dependencies and you found an X point. You had a specific causal model that you were specifically saying it could do this likely in that circumstance, because that's how it seems from what you're describing.
It didn't start out like that, right? I didn't see a way of beating the game, right? All I did was desperation. I tried to do something, and then I noticed that the game didn't react. And then I made an inference and said, well, maybe it doesn't see it, which I didn't buy it at the beginning, but when I did more and more and it started being threatening, the game didn't react. It simply had made a decision that this thing is not threatening, just completely ignored it.
It started like a kind of quasi babbling, or it was like it was just flailing. And then
yeah. I was flailing.
On top of that.
I was flailing, but then the flailing became more and more goal directed when it was clear that there was a way out. And I remember that that's also many more ago. But they played, I think, some kind of war game. Again, the AI had to balance it out 10 times more resources, because otherwise the humans would blow it out of the water at the time, right? It's a long time ago. But the point was, even with this, humans could actually fool the AI completely. They basically would send out an unarmed group of pioneers. Because they were unarmed, the AI didn't bother fighting them. These pioneers would go to the headquarters of the AI, would mine it and blow it up. That was all, right? I mean, no human would allow that, right? This was obvious, right? Just get rid of them. They're you don't know what they're going to do. But the AI, okay, they're not dangerous. Let's just.
So one might be a bit of a tangent, but while I'm complaining about DeepMind, I'm thinking of when they beat StarCraft. And at first, this claim was that, like, for instance, they had like capped the actions per minute and that it was doing it like the right way. I'm very skeptical of that, because I think a lot of the motions of the advanced player, like when they're going like 400 moves a minute, a lot of them are kind of like buffering things. It's like setting up like reaction loops and a means of chunking. I don't think they're all like, we're not doing 400 meaningful actions a minute. I'm very skeptical of that. But
yeah.
But then I was wondering, like, but let's say like what you're going for is like some sort of notable strategic advantage in, let's say, something like drone warfare. Does it matter? Like, so then I guess I was wondering, is like, so the kind of creativity you're describing, even if it's like finding the virus against the aliens in Independence Day, like, how powerful is that? Like, so let's say you have let's say you are dealing with something like trying to coordinate a drone army. Like, humans and their ability to, like, I guess, quantum tunnel to solutions, or make specific teleological beelines to particular optima based on particular causal models. Like, how advantageous is that? Or is it just like in that sort of scenario, do you think, like, or is it just like speed and ability to keep track of a lot of units? That might just be all you need, and there's no need to have like humans in the mix. Like,
I think we're not there yet, right? I mean, I don't think there's anything magic to human ability. Okay, so I don't think it's like there's this spiritus vitalis that's kind of special to humans, right? Every time we thought something is special for living organism, organic and inorganic chemistry, every time we thought there's or celestial and earthly physics, Aristotle, every time we found out it's wrong, right? So I don't believe there's something that's fundamentally different or fundamentally superior in living organisms. But I do think that the solutions we have now for AI, they lack the essential ingredient to get this point. So I do think humans, especially clever humans, still can make a cut. you have as a human no chance of beating a computer in a homogeneous scenario which is well trained by the computer. So if you have some kind of dogfight in the air which is trained with 300 billion data points, and you get the same hardware, humans and robots, I don't think the human has the slightest chance. No way. Okay, everything's homogeneous, everything is covered, everything is mapped. That is the domain of the machine, uncontested. But wherever this is not the case, and there's lots of inhomogeneity, and there are holes in the space, humans are much better at seeing these holes than the machines are. Now, what is it that we are missing in the AI? It's a good question. Let me take a step back, right? So you were saying there's a meta level in this and imitating the hippocampus and so on. Now here is what bugs me about thinking in this way. Evolution did not have an engineer sitting around saying, oh, wow, we'll need now this, and now we need amygdala, perhaps. Let's add a thalamus, cortex, prefrontal, or just frontal lobes. That's not how nature works, right? So it must be something that emerges through possibly necessity. I don't even resist necessarily a proto-Lamarckian drive. We know that there are intrinsic motivations. We know that intrinsic motivation is good candidates for local developments. I can imagine easily that there are informational drives, for example. I mean, I would, of course, talk about information. There may be others, informational drives that favor certain structures emerging. But what I'm asking is, what are the things that make, say, the brain add these extra structures? Are these additions essential? Are they necessary? Are they incidental? I don't think they're incidental. They happen to many organisms, right? They happen in birds. They happen in octopuses, which are very far away from us. So it's very clear that something like cerebellum, for example, octopuses have an analog of the cerebellum. Okay, and we split up from them 400 million years ago. It's very clear this is necessary. Somehow nature found it's necessary, and development went there. So I don't want a solution where this is tacked on. I want a solution where we understand how is it discovered, because only then we understand how these degrees of freedom, or these abstractions, or these out of the box thinking, or whatever we want to call it, how it's actually handled by nature, right? Maybe there are technical ways of doing that don't require to go through all the steps of evolution. That's possible. I'm not excluding that, but I do not think it's simply tacked on. And the problem with the current machinery is huge example sets, huge parameter sets, and still just interpolates. It doesn't learn anything outside of its domain of competence. There's something very special about organisms. They have this uncanny ability to see things far beyond their realm of operation. Sometimes it doesn't matter. I mean, the birds on this island I visit on, they just bumped into stuff, and I don't know whether they died or just bumped and complained, right? You bumped and croaked, but they did not have any selection pressure. In the moment you have some selection pressure, it starts.
So I'm thinking of different ways of expanding counterfactual processing abilities. So like I could see, for instance, like So like there's speculations about so I mean ultimately I think if I'm understanding what you're saying is like what we're going for is the cybernetic description that abstracts away from any given implementation and would basically explain the functionality regardless of its particular realization, and basically explain the convergence we've seen in evolution, separate times, the same capacity, and then ultimately what we want is to recapitulate these things in artificial systems. And
Yes.
so we're going to need to kick ourselves free of like, to another abstraction layer of this cybernetic description of in the language of information theory of what a goal-oriented system needs to do and how it needs to basically, what data structures it'll need, how it'll need to manage them. In terms of so there seems to be so it's not just like the capacity to hold in mind a counterfactual, but it's for this counterfactual. I guess so. So to what degree, let's say we're dealing with like a reinforcement learner that has access to capacities to some sort of world model it can use to do like something like a dreamer-like architecture that could do basically like a rollout, like an imaginative rollout. It seems like it's still not doing what you're describing, but it seems like it's moving in that direction. But what's missing?
It goes in the direction, I agree. I mean, the rollout, this imagined rollout is a good idea, actually. The dreamer is a good idea. The problem with the rollout is a very specific instance, right? But a dreaming rollout is actually coming closer to what I'm looking for, because a dreaming rollout is a rollout that does not have to be possible. It could be a rollout that is dreaming of something impossible, something that actually cannot happen, that's wrong in the real world, but that actually moves you into an area where you can find a way around this impossibility, right? So the whole technology that we have, right? When people do technology, right? People dreamt of flying for a long time. And the question is really what changed that made it possible. So two things changed. Number one, systematics, right? So systematic science started to put the different things together that make it possible to build, better engines and better devices. And then you had an engine, and then suddenly you discovered, okay, there's aerodynamics. And so you found systematic ways of doing these things. The goal was always in sight. Was always visible. It was always still in front of you, and all the moves you made just increased the number of tools that were available to you to bridge the gap to that goal. Okay, so this is, by the way, one thing I make now in the side that's I may have made it before, but I do think it's an important point, so I don't feel ashamed to say it again. Our society always talks about applications, and all of these blue sky research should be applied and should directly feed into industry. And I'm saying, well, that's certainly good and that's certainly important, but I do think that the whole point of blue sky research is creating a map of the unknown that will in time be filled up. And at some point you can do island hopping. And at some point you suddenly completely make accessible completely new areas that were totally inaccessible before. You can't do that incrementally. These have to be jumps, leaps of faith. So back to our main topic. So these leaps of faith, they need to be directed, or they can be directed. And when you have a goal, it makes it easier to direct them. So if I'm dreaming of getting to fly, of course, what I'm trying to look at is birds and wings and mechanism. And Leonardo da Vinci already, we know he tried it. We don't know whether his devices flew, but we know he tried it. we actually do know, I think, was it Cyrano de Bergerac? I know that there is an earlier story by Lucian to as a flight to the moon, but I don't know how realistic the mechanism was. But Cyrano de Bergerac already suggested rockets to fly, for a man to fly to the moon. That is 400 years ago, 500 years ago. Okay, it was not very realistic, but he had the right idea, right? I mean, that's what we do. The details need to be worked out. Okay. In other words, whatever we need is something that can abstract away from the concrete simulation. And that is not obvious. Maybe in language is needed. I'm not sure that language is needed, because I do think that as we
and we had the other non-human primates who were showing some pretty impressive abilities without syntactic language. So it
Yep.
seems so maybe could it be that like, so among like three classes of things they're coming to my mind. One would be basically the infinite use of finite means of language. The other would be some kind of either learning curriculum or embodied priors to draw upon, of like some sort of the act of flying, the act of going through the trees, giving you a certain like flexible modeling capacity, a kind of virtual machine you can use, or some sort of like architectural description of like robustifying, like robustifying attractor networks of the of the hippocampal system, or like even without language, like some accounts of like Hox genes, like or like increasing like the ability of doing like precise sequencing, and maybe like recursive sequencing or something, like you just a general capacity for like something like that. But it seems like well, I guess maybe is it like if any of so there's like a few classes of things that could be sufficient on their own, but together could be synergistic. Maybe that's the way of
they have to fit together, right? I mean, the point in discovery is the discovery must be feasible by putting similar things that you already know together. Okay, so maybe language is necessary to get really to high levels of this, right? So because what language does, it allows you to track abstract objects, remove properties, and send them on their own way, bereft of what they were before. Okay, so you take an object that you talk about one object that does something, and then this object is essentially bereft of many properties, right? If I say a ball, it's not a concrete ball, right? It's a ball you imagine. It's probably, can you tell me what you think the ball is? Which color, what material?
vinyl, vinyl, white and black pentagons or hexagons or something.
Okay, so you're thinking of football, right? But in fact, what I thought about is a plastic ball, orange red, which is basically full of air. And okay, so the point is, when I said a ball, I actually removed all the properties except for one. It's an object I can hold and can throw. That's all we kept from this thing. And it didn't bother us because the color was not important. It was not important that it's plastic. It was not important that it's filled with air, right? It could be a wooden ball made out of wood. The point is that once you removed all these properties, you can talk about things that it can do. It can roll, you can throw it, you can roll it down an inclined plane, whatever you can do. So in other words, what happened is something very interesting, that now you have a new universe in which you can make things do stuff that the original thing couldn't do, simply because it's not as well specified anymore. specification is now far less restrictive. And now you can actually think of that in this less restrictive model. So when you imagine yourself flying, it has to do with the fact that, well, it's an object and stuff can just move through the air if there's no gravity, right? You forget about gravity, because when you just think about it, you can, stuff can fly. That's why magic works in stories and not in real life, right? Magic is, many stories have magic, and this is part of the story, and we can, does magic and it transforms it into a bird or transforms it into an animal. Yeah, sure, why not? I mean, we can't do that. There's lots of magic things that we can do now. People actually underestimate the fact that we actually are magicians now, though not on our own, right? So the magic we do is, of course, technology, right? The fact that we are talking and you're sitting essentially on the other side of the ocean would be in the 15th, 16th century, that would be magic. To be able to communicate like that, that is an ability worth of being burned at the stake or something, right? So it's definitely an ability that is beyond what the typical human at that time could even conceive being done by, say, means of equivalent realism as making a hole in the ground or drilling a well or something like that. So
it's almost sounding like it's the disembodiment, like the removal from the embeddings that's giving you this like combinatorial power and like the ability, like, so you don't yet know how the goal will be achieved or what set of solutions will be best for achieving it within a given context or achieving the goal at all. But because you can like take this goal representation and divorce it from any particular realization, it now can become basically like a pointer or a hub, that like a point of nucleation for a lot of different plans that could then be basically even like the analogy of like you're saying, like you want to go to the moon, like the rocket. There was some sort of thing that was a little bit like that before, but that can then be extended. But if you have like some node and some like symbolic network that's still, it can provide sort of bridging of like pulling along the relevant information if it's sufficiently connected to it and then shared by this other goal. And then you have basically candidate solutions that can be tried on.
yes,
precise.
exactly. You couldn't have said it better myself, right? So that's probably, I mean, the Stuart Kaufman is now currently working on a theory. I think it's called the adjacent possible or something similar. And what's really nice about that, it models several things. It models the accumulation of abilities or uses or features you can extend a system by. And it computes, oh, well, how many such extensions are possible when you have so many. And it turns out that he can derive an equation where at some point the thing whole explodes. So it basically at the beginning there's only very slow growth of possibilities, and there's a sudden upturn. It's basically like an elbow switch when it explodes. You could call it a singularity if you like, right? So this is a really neat idea. I mean, it's not entirely the whole background of this question is not entirely new. I mean, the singularity came from the differential equation where you say, well, I have all these things that can interact. So normally when you have growth, you have x dot equals x. Okay, so you have an exponential growth. But in growth of, say, societies or technology, you can say actually you want to measure the growth of combinations. So if there's x and it can talk to other x's, and so the actual growth rate is x squared, and that of course gives you a much more drastic growth characteristic when you integrate it. And the theory of the adjacent possible takes that essentially, it says, okay, we make it generalize it. There's not just one object you can pair with, there are multiple objects you can pair with, and he has a theory for that.
Like a
So
general account of phase transitions and the creation of new regimes, where it's like,
I don't think he gets a hard phase transition, right? It is still continuous, but it's very, very pronounced.
I see.
Yeah. Maybe in reality there's a phase transition. Maybe there's a way of making it a phase transition, but this is not what this is not a hard consequence of the theory, right? So it's simply a very pronounced switch of the growth at a certain point. Yeah, and that is possible. I can imagine that. I mean, we have seen that every time there's a new medium, every time there's a new type of approach to stuff, you suddenly see this incredible growth of ideas, incredible accumulation of ideas. Internet really was a game changer, for example.
So as we're expanding this edge of the adjacent past, we're expanding, I guess, our cognitive light cones. At what point are what kinds of self-reference abilities afforded and required? And at what point are they assets or problems to manage? So I guess I'm thinking of like, if you're modeling yourself in a future pursuing plans, at what point do we start entering into a kind of a strange loop territory of where planning becomes actually I don't know if it's maybe more challenging because of like the capacity of feedback with self-reference, or is that not a problem? So,
well, to be honest, that's a very good question. But I'm a little bit, as a downer, I'm usually like to pop paradox up.
Good.
So I try to demystify paradox, and I didn't used to do that, but I discovered more and more that many of the paradoxes just disappear once you look at them properly, and then they become, the interesting thought models, but they are not really paradox anymore. So the question of recursion is an interesting one. Recursion, in my opinion, is a form of symmetry. So it's symmetric in the sense that it's like a randomization group, right? You look at something and you look at the something that's coarsened or simplified or changed or modified, but essentially do the same thing. It's a symmetry. So there's nothing inherently magical about recursion, except that you have to keep memory. Okay, except for the fact that to make recursion work, you need something, an external or internal memory, that keeps track of what you did. That being said, I do actually think that recursion is the big step that made it possible for us to talk about language. So stacking thoughts together, talking about things that relate to other things that relate to other things. So that means you can keep basically tracking back whatever thought there is, at least in principle. You at least know in principle how to do that. And you can build up these sequences and simulate them and retrace them. That is different from pure stimulus response sequences that you just run in one way, but you actually trace them back. You have an audit trail of what you are thinking about. That being said, so the paradoxon that you're saying, what is a strange loop? I'm thinking about myself doing this and this and this. And here is of course, if I want to really mess up the game, is a classic paradoxon is like, I'm a liar. Okay, is this true or is it false? Right? If I say, well, I'm a liar, is it true or is it false? Now, the dirty trick that math does is that it pretends there's no time. Right? So if there is no time, then you have a real paradox, because everything has to be either true or false. That's what it is. Now, if you go to physics, the thing resolves. If you take a negator, take a circuit where you put false, it means a 0 into the input, and it gives you a true, it means a 1 on the output, and then you connect it. That's the paradox. You force it to be both true and false.
a flip-flop switch. Oh.
A flip-flop switch is just a memory, right? But here I'm just taking negator. No flip-flop, no memory, nothing. What does this do? It will do something, right? As a physical system. What will it do?
Alternate between true and false in its readout.
Exactly. It will oscillate. It will just oscillate at the highest frequency it can do. That's all. No magic, right? It will basically use time to resolve the paradox. So if you imagine, I used to play with a thought experiment. It's a nice thought experiment I like to play with, and that is, if the universe really started at some point, and it's expanding, so we can assume that the phase space expands. If the phase space expands, the possible entropy of the universe that the universe can actually have goes up. So when the universe was very small in the beginning, the possible entropy might be limited. If you limit the possible entropy, means there's only so much information you can store. So there might be a time where the universe was so small that you couldn't even store the whole set of digits of pi, right? You could not even, pi was not even well defined then, right? This would make some lawmakers in certain American states happy, because I think there was one state that they tried to actually define pi as 3.2 or something. Not even 3.1, it was 3.2. So you couldn't even define pi, but I could also imagine that if you have what I call a Gödelian theorem that is, or a Gödelian contradiction, that for whose proof you need more time than the universe will live, you can as well pretend it's true, or it's at least, no, you can't find a counterproof. In other words, if the universe is short-lived enough that the counterproof cannot be constructed, the contradiction cannot be constructed, you can work with it as if it's true. Think of it as a game, where you have a game where you play this game and there's a possibility of finding a contradictory rule, where basically in the situation there are two rules of the game that contradict, where you can't actually continue playing because the game is badly defined. It's not defined anymore how to move on. But if the game always ends before this point is reached, you can play this game without any problem. So mathematically, this game has a paradoxical trap, but de facto it does not. In other words, we have to think about, when we think about strange loops, paradoxa, and self-reference, and so on, we have always to ask ourselves, do we try to get rid of time? Sometimes it's possible, that's fine. But sometimes it's the wrong thing to do. Sometimes you have to keep time because it's actually tracking how far you went down the rabbit hole.
So, two things. What you were saying about a small early universe only being able to support so much entropy. So Sean Carroll will sometimes talk about like the arrow of time from like the past hypothesis that like, could that explain like why the early universe was low entropy? Just there wasn't another option just because of the size and the.
Yes, I mean, what I'm talking here, I'm talking through my head, right? I mean, we don't know exactly whether entropy is really constrained that way, or whether there may be degrees of freedom that where they are open, which we are not open anymore today. But you know, if you just do naive phase space considerations, that may well be the case, right? Maybe if there's a highest energy, so that means that there's a limit to the size of the phase space and of momentum, and then space is the other limit. If there's no other degree of freedom that's somehow hidden elsewhere, then yes, entropy might be limited, bounded, strongly bounded at the beginning of the universe. Maybe the universe was not a point, right? Maybe it was finite, and so there was enough entropy to store a lot of stuff. But what I'm saying is, at least we have to think about entropy is limited, and this limit was much smaller at some point, and may have been so small that certain things could not be expressed. Probably were not well defined.
You might have been talking out of your hat, but I think I don't know, that seems like a thread to come back to. But also, so it's not necessarily, so what seems like an irreconcilable paradox is just because of a certain atemporal myopia. But so there's, issues of like, you need something, capable of giving you the memory, something that's capable of being modified and updated, and
Yes.
and not basically and behaving nicely under those modifications enough that it's holding on to the structure and can serve as a memory, rather than some
Yes.
sort of like catastrophic forgetting in it. So I guess to what degree for something like robust language, so something like an integrated world model, a unified data structure, maybe centered on something like embodied simulation, something like the relationship of the system and its interactions with the world. And this being like a common reference point that's updated as basically strings are being processed. And
we really don't know how language works, right? I mean, at least I don't. I mean, maybe some people know more. I'm sure many people know more than I do. But I think we think too much in terms of engineering, and engineering has an advantage and disadvantage. Engineering is something that humans have thought out, and it is explainable, it's transportable to others. But it does not capture, in my opinion, what nature has to be able to do, right? So if you have in nature all these memories and things like that, this is pretty ad hoc. Nature must be pretty ad hoc. It does not, I think the genius idea of Darwin is in design, the design must be unintelligent. Okay, unintelligent design. I mean, there is this thing about intelligent design that, oh, we can't get that. The whole trick of Darwin is that somehow, with very small and very slow accumulation of individual crumbs of information, you would build a structure that was capable of actually doing all this incredibly complex information processing. And you ask yourself, okay, how does it work? And the more I think about that, the more I come to the conclusion that is actually forced on us by the fact that we are constrained in how much information we can transport. So, of course, I will say that, right? Information theory is my thing, but this is not random. So let me put it this way. I brought this, I think I mentioned this example before, but I think this is a very important example because it clarifies what I mean. So if I give you a box, an empty box, and I show you this box, 2D box. Well, it's not 2D, it can be 3D, but think of a 2D box. This box is 2D, and what is it? This is R2, some space. And now I take this box and put an orange in there, or 2 or 3. And they roll around and do stuff. And the oranges, you can think of chunks of something that takes up resource, in this case, space. And they roll around. And I add more, and they still roll around. At some point, they can't roll around anymore. I want to squeeze more and more oranges in, And now they have to be parsimonious. And as they are parsimonious, they have to organize themselves. And it's not something I'm doing or planning. They just organize themselves into a hexagonal grid. Automatically. Very simple. You don't need to do much. Right? I have tried it myself. You take these little balls, let them roll around, and as you increase gravity, the rolling stops, and they basically organize themselves into a hexagonal grid. Where does this grid come from? Was it there? It wasn't there. The balls don't know about the grid. The space doesn't know about the grid. But the combination of constraint and space requirements forces the grid upon us. Of course, you can actually understand some parts of the grid by looking at so-called root systems. Root systems is a mathematical structure that basically tells you how you can partition space in a regular way, more or less. That's kind of in a nutshell. But the point is really that you now said you have these resources and they have to organize themselves, and now they are forced into this very regular structure that was not there before. And it can be very global. You fill the whole thing and you get crystals. I mean, crystals are like that. Now, crystals are the very simple example. Many people say, well, crystals could be seen as proto-life. Well, they're not life, strictly spoken, but they have some properties that make them somehow...
The hallmarks of the living.
What?
You have some of the hallmarks of the living.
Exactly, right? And now imagine that we do that for information. Now, the little balls we are taking that take up space don't take up space, to take up information. And you need to squeeze this information, limited space and limited capacity. And suddenly you are forced, not because somebody told you to, or not somebody arranged it to, you're just forced by force of competition, force of selection, to squeeze this information into limited space. Suddenly you get all these structures. And because information is far more complex than space, you suddenly get all these structures for free. But of course, not for free. Somebody has to process them. So you need a counterpart that can actually handle the structure. We are not talking about space. We're talking about bandwidth or mental space. And now you have a selection pressure on cognitive structures that process this. So this is what I think is happening. It cannot be a singular point of contact. It must be very simple but very universal principle, because brains emerge regularly in different branches of the animal kingdom. This is something that's not a fluke. Reemerges. And in fact, where brains are not needed, nature gets rid of them. There's this animal, I keep forgetting the name. That animal is a kind of fish that swims around until it finds a rock, then attaches.
Sea squirt.
Sea squirt, yes, that's it. Sea squirt. And when it attaches to the rock and knows it will never move again from there, it eats its own brain. Tishby used to make the joke that this is like a tenured professor.
That was Tishby.
Yes.
That ties things together nicely. I was wondering if maybe next time you would mind getting more into informational bottlenecks together.
Sure. I will be delighted to. So this is the reason why I think actually you can. I'm not saying, again, it's always dangerous if I keep banging on this information is everything, right? Because there's so many clever ideas and so many clever views on things. It's certainly will be wrong. But what I do think is that it's definitely worth looking into as one driver of structure formation in the how we perceive the world, and of course the counterpart of it, and how the brain needs to process it. And now we don't know exactly how the brain now does the abstraction. Where does it come from? We have no idea, right? So what are the processing paradigms that the brain is forced to do. Well, no idea is probably too strong a word. We have some idea, but there is no coherent story on that. And this is something where I feel this is still missing to get a coherent story out of that. And if we look at neural networks, they do solve part of the problem very, very well. And you will also notice that, for example, auto-associators have a lot in common with a bottleneck, with information bottleneck. Yeah, they are in a way, they are kind of information bottleneck, even if they are not directed to minimize information per se, but they have a lot in common with it.
Kinds of bottlenecks, kinds of workspaces, and their virtues and their vices.
Indeed.
Next time?
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to keeping going and going deeper. So thank you, Daniel.
Most welcome. It was a pleasure.
I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.